Hello. Today we're going to be doing something a little bit different. Since the Steam 2022, history of what you did in this year thing was released, I decided it might be kind of interesting to review and rate every single game that I played on Steam in 2022. It's going to be a fairly long list. There's 44 games here. There will be timestamps throughout if you want to skip ahead to your particular game. And I will be doing them in ascending order. So starting with the game that I enjoyed the least for the year. Now, this is just a ranking based off of my personal enjoyment, and I'm going to put, I guess, a bit more of a focus on just briefly explaining what the games are, in the hopes that anybody who watches my content will, and presumably likes the same types of games as me, will find something here that they're interested in playing. Most of these games do fall sort of under the same sort of genres that I play. Now, making the list was a bit weird because different genres I enjoy for different things. It's, putting a visual novel compared to an RPG or a strategy game or a puzzle game. I mean, comparing those things was quite difficult. As a general rule, if a game had a lot of replayability, it would rank higher on the list just because, it's the kind of thing that I'd go back to and play again. However, there are also cases on the list where games kind of suffer from burnout, where it did have replayability and I played it a lot, but then it kind of fell down on the list because I just don't really want to play it again at the moment. And as a general tiebreaker, if I had two games next to each other and I wasn't really sure what order to put them in, just kind of at the time of making the list, just kind of gut feeling, like if I had to pick one of these two games to play at this moment, which one would I prefer? That sort of ended up being the general tiebreaker. Now you can see some gameplay footage for Chrono Ark in the background right now, and I'll get more into that game in a moment, but I just want to say, before going any further, that I took care not to put any story spoilers or anything like that in the footage that you'll be seeing. In some cases, in particular, story-heavy RPGs where the narrative is an important part of the experience, I started a new game and recorded relatively near the beginning for quite a few games. I think I did the same things with some of the Metroidvanias just to, avoid spoiling mechanics and things like that. So you should be safe to see everything in the background without being spoiled on anything that might impact your enjoyment of a game if you enjoy playing games blind. Also, a couple of the games on this list do feature not safe for work content, but obviously I will not be showing any of that content, although I will be, as part of the review, talking about what the games have for that. And again, there are timestamps all throughout, so if you want to skip a particular game for whatever reason, you are free to do so. With that, let's just briefly talk about Chrono Ark. This game is a bit of a weird one. I didn't actually want to include it on this list, but because I'm the kind of person who gets obsessive over details that don't really matter, I knew it would bother me to leave it out. So the thing is, Chrono Ark is a game that I haven't actually played. I did open it, though, in Steam. It's the only game on this list that's like this. I spent a couple of hours with it, but not playing with it. So what is Chrono Ark? Chrono Ark is a deck building game. You have a party of characters, and your final deck is like each character contributes a few decks to a few cards to their own individual deck, and your final deck that you're using is just a combination of all of your characters' individual decks. And then there are mechanics that make the game punishes you, basically. The cards get more expensive if you try to play multiple cards from the same character, so you're encouraged to spread out and utilize multiple characters throughout. Now, the problem with this game, and the reason why I haven't really played it a whole lot, is that, I was playing the game in Korean. It does have English, but, 제가 한국에서 살지만, 한국말 좀 힘들어요. 그래서 제가 한국말 공부하고 싶었어요. 수업은 별로 재미없어서 제가 게임으로 공부하는데 좋다고 생각했어요. 그래서 크로노 아크는 그 한국 게임이에요. 제가 한국말로 했고 재미있게 공부할 수 있다고 생각했지만 좀 힘들었어. 너무 천천히 해서 별로 재미없는 것 같았어요. So yeah, it was kind of a personal choice. The game's also coming out of early access in the near future. I do hope to play it on release, probably in English for the channel, since I love card games, and I don't think I've done a card game on the channel, unless you count Thea way back in the day. Alright, so with that, let's move on to the list proper. Well, with any tier list or ranking list, there's going to have to be one thing that's on the bottom, and for me, the least enjoyed game of 2022 was Don't Starve Together, which is the multiplayer version of Don't Starve. Now, I have a group of family members, there's 4 of us, that play games together, but a problem that we have is that we don't like the same type of games, which makes gaming kind of awkward. So this was an experiment. This was a game that we looked at and we thought, okay, maybe this will be fun to do as a group, and we got into it and didn't particularly enjoy it. Well, I think of the 4 of us, I was the most negative towards it. So what is Don't Starve Together? It is a roguelike crafting game. You have to manage your health, your hunger, of course, and your sanity. And so you go out into the world, gather resources, build things, get food, fight monsters, all that stuff. Now, I'm actually okay with crafting as a mechanic, and I enjoy roguelikes. But this game in particular, for whatever reason, it just didn't jive with me. I found the controls to be somewhat clunky. In particular, one memorable moment was a frog attacked me behind a tree, and I had to cut the tree down first in order to be able to click on the frog. I'm sure that with practice and experience, as with most things, I'd get better at it, but my impression of this game was not overall positive, and I ended up dropping it before really getting anywhere with it. And don't have much more to say about that. Terraria is a side-scrolling crafting and combat game. You're exploring a world, gathering resources, and fighting bosses in order to get stronger so that you can explore more and fight more. I remember enjoying this game quite a bit the first time I played it, but going back into it recently, everything just felt like work starting over, and I didn't find myself terribly motivated to continue with it. I would say that the combat is okay for what it is. The progression is reasonably satisfying as you do it. The exploration is alright. The crafting, there's a good variety of things to do. You can build up a settlement, which is nice. But overall, the experience just didn't feel that interesting to me on a replay through, so I don't really see myself playing this again in the future. Blocks That Matter is a puzzle platformer that utilizes Tetris mechanics. You play as the Tetrabot, which is a little robot that runs around collecting blocks, and as long as you have 4 blocks in your possession, you can place them back out into the world in any Tetronimo shape. The different blocks have different properties, which can be used for various puzzle-like purposes. For example, sand blocks will fall, but wood blocks won't. Using these, you try to get to new areas or to get the treasure block on each stage. You can also try to exit the stage with as many leftover blocks as possible in order to get a high score. The main story of the game was pretty simple to get through. It's really the optimization that is where things get difficult. Overall, I'd say this is a cute little game and is probably worth playing through once if you enjoy games in this genre and want something that's not going to be too terribly taxing. Cave Story is a Metroidvania, an indie game that's almost 20 years old now. And I missed it when it first came out, but recently decided, now that I've decided I like Metroidvanias, to go back and try this game out. And it's alright. There's a story, a decent story to it, and the combat itself has some interesting mechanics that I haven't seen elsewhere. In this game, you defeat monsters to get these little triangle power-ups that will increase the effectiveness of your current weapon. The problem with this kind of a system, though, is that it rewards good play, but, well, basically once you start losing, then you start losing hard. Because not only do you take damage by getting hit, but then your weapon's effectiveness also decreases. So it's a very punishing system in that way. The main issue I have with this game is that I don't particularly like the movement. The way the character feels is just way too floaty. So this is not a game that I see myself ever playing to completion. Siralim 3 is a monster capturing game, but unlike a game like Pokemon, in this game you have your entire team of 6 monsters all fighting simultaneously in a JRPG kind of menu system. One thing that I like about Siralim is that there's a built-in macro system in the game that allows you to program behaviors for your troops, and you can do it individually. So, for example, you can have a monster that'll have a heal move that it'll only use if one of your monsters is at low health. The game itself is pretty grindy. There's a lot of doing the same action over and over in order to get things to go bigger. I feel like I've only really scratched the surface of what the game has to offer, and from what I've seen from Steam discussions and other places, there's a lot of things that you can do in this game in order to really max out your team. Because of the way that the macros work, the strategy I find is a lot more about making a team that will be able to auto-battle things effectively. And if the battle starts going poorly in the middle of it, you can just stop the macro and actually manually take control. But I feel like you're really going to want to have a strong macro and a good team composition going forward. And there's a bunch of other things that I haven't unlocked yet, like monster breeding and things like that, that'll allow you to really customize your troops. So if this is the kind of thing that you're into, then I think that there's probably a lot here to this game. Unfortunately, it just kind of suffers from the same issues that I have with a game like Pokemon, where the core gameplay loop just I lose interest in it after a short amount of time. This is not something I could sit down and play for a long period of time, but it is something I can spend a few minutes with here and there if I feel like, making progress towards something. Realm Grinder is a clicker game, and in clicker fashion, numbers get pretty ridiculous as you go. In this game, you have a number of different fantasy races that you can choose to play as, and each race gets a bunch of bonuses to different ways of making production. The good races, from what I can tell, tend to have a focus on more active clicker playstyle, whereas the evil races tend to be more of a passive idle style. I quite like playing as the fairies. The game may initially appear to be quite simple, but as you play it and unlock new systems, particularly the research system I found, the number of ways in which you can customize your strategy get pretty ridiculous. This isn't a mindless clicker game. This is a game that has a lot of number crunching and calculations involved if you really want to maximize your profit. That being said, this is a clicker game, so there's not going to be a whole lot of gameplay outside of number goes up. Unfortunately, this game has the distinction of being my most played game on Steam, according to my playtime. But the vast majority of that was not me actively playing the game. I love card games. And when I first discovered the digital card game space, it was with Infinity Wars nearly 10 years ago. This game does some really cool things in the digital card game space. In fact, it does things that you could not do with a paper card game, or at least not easily or conveniently. Which I think is something that a digital card game should be embracing. Unfortunately, Infinity Wars in its current iteration is not as good as it once was. The game has suffered from some sort of developmental issues. The game itself was cancelled or discontinued, and then the developers brought it back, but they're currently doing, I think, a ground-up rewrite. So the game's kind of in a messy spot. The biggest issue being that there's not really any single-player content at the moment. There's an incomplete tutorial and no single-player campaign. And I remember the campaign being pretty fun for the game back when it first existed. Now, the game in its current form on Steam is playable. You can sign up for an account for free and get a bunch of pre-made decks that you can then play against the AI, who will be running one of those randomly selected pre-made decks as well. And you should be able to, at the very least, experience the things that this game does well in that format, because that's what I want to focus on here. This is a game that, as somebody who's played a lot of card games and even designed some card games, I think that Infinity Wars does some really cool things. So I mentioned earlier that it takes advantage of being in the digital space. The first way that it does this is that it has simultaneous turns. Both you and your opponent do all your actions, and then after you've determined what you want to do, you lock those actions in, and once both players have locked in their actions, then all the actions play out. The combat of the game takes place on a relatively simple battlefield. You have a support zone where your troops are relatively safe. You have an attack zone where your troops there attack the opponent's fortress, and you have a defense zone where you try to block the enemy's troops that are attacking your fortress. To win the game, there's two main victory conditions. Either you attack the enemy's fortress enough until their fortress is destroyed, or you run the opponent's morale down to 0. The most common way of dealing morale damage to your opponent is by killing their characters. More powerful characters, and in particular certain legendaries, tend to have high morale costs, so that can be a thing to consider. You don't want to just keep sacrificing your units over and over again. So overall, my experience with this game has been incredibly positive, even though it's not really in a state where I feel compelled to play it at the moment. One other thing I want to point out about it is the lore, the world building. There's not really a whole lot of that right now, but as you can see from the loading screens currently at least in the current version of the demo, they seem to be focusing on the conflict between the Cult of Aurora and the Descendants of the Dragon. Now, the Descendants of the Dragon were my favorite faction back when I was playing this game more regularly. They're a defense-focused faction that have a bunch of fun effects where if your opponents don't attack into you, then they suffer morale damage, do things like that. So they're sort of the alternate victory faction. And thematically this fits in with the world where many of the other factions in this world are trying to conquer their opponents, but the world where the Descendants of the Dragon exist, basically the entire world is controlled by the Cult of Aurora, and the Descendants are holding out in like one final city. So for them, victory is just survival. And before I finish talking about this game, I just want to bring up one more example of how the simultaneous turns really affect how the game works. The Cult of Aurora has a spell called Mass Death, which when you play it, it just kills all characters for both players in the attack and defense zones. And so you have this problem where you're killing your own characters when you play the card, but if you're playing against your opponent, you don't know if they've played the card or not until you've both locked in your actions for the turn. Mass Death, I believe, also had an additional restriction on it where you could not move your units out of the attack and defense zones the turn that you played it, which means that you can try to trick your opponent by retreating all of your troops back into the support zone for a turn, and then maybe they'll assume a Mass Death is coming, but then you can attack instead of casting the spell on your next turn. There's some interesting mind games that go along with that. So overall, very interesting system, interesting game, and I hope that the developers continue their work on it and can make this game shine again like it used to. Starbound is a crafting and exploration game that will inevitably bring comparisons to Terraria, in part because I believe they have the same pixel artist, or at least the same pixel artist has done work for both games. Starbound is not just Terraria in space, though. It is its own entity. I think that the reason I like this game over Terraria is that it has more of a focus on exploration than on combat. And it also gives me a better sense of direction in terms of just having little tasks to do and feeling like I'm making progress on the things that I'm trying to accomplish. It's also satisfying building up a ship over time and having a ship that's persistent between worlds while you're exploring other worlds for various resources or artifacts or whatever it is that you're looking for. Like Terraria, though, this game does have some issues. I feel that the movement in this game is not very fun, and the combat can be a little bit messy. It does do a very good job of having a cohesive narrative throughout the game, though, and I like the preset set pieces where you have certain dungeons that you have to go into and things like that. Slay the Spire is a roguelike deck builder. I like roguelikes, I like card games, and I particularly like deck builders. And I had a lot of fun with this game when I was first playing through it. The game has 4 different classes, each of which has a very distinctive play style and a bunch of unique gimmicks, which is great. And the cards themselves are relatively straightforward individually, but as with most card games, the complexity comes in the combinations and the way that you build your deck up as a whole. I think the randomness in the game really is a selling point for it, because it makes each run fresh and allows you to experience new things and play around with new cards on each run. However, this blessing also ended up being a bit of a curse, because I found that once I had played with everything, I started wanting to make very specific kind of weird combo decks, and the RNG just wasn't giving me the cards that I needed for it. So replaying the game after a certain point became a little bit frustrating when runs started to feel the same, but it took me many, many hours to get to that point. One criticism that I would have of Slay the Spire is that I feel like the runs go on for a bit too long. When you have a roguelike game, part of the appeal of that is the ability to iterate, right? To go over the process multiple times, starting over from the beginning. And if your game's taking you a couple of hours to do a run, that's kind of counterproductive in my view. Finally, I just want to say that as somebody who watches other people play card games, and particularly people who don't have a lot of experience with card games, keep in mind that when you're building a deck, adding more cards to the deck is reducing the chances of you drawing any of the previous cards in your deck. So when the game offers you 3 cards, there is a 4th option, which is to not take any of those 3 cards, and sometimes that is in fact the best option. Some of my most successful runs in this game have come about from me having a smaller deck at the end than when I started the run. It can be very powerful to keep your deck as small as possible. And this isn't something just for Slay the Spire, this is something that I would recommend in general. For competitive card games, like Magic the Gathering for example, at a competitive level, people generally run the smallest possible deck size because that ensures the highest amount of consistency in what they're doing. And in a roguelike game, you need consistency because you only have to die once for the run to be over. Mindustry is a game about automation and tower defense. You have a bunch of resources out in the world that you need to mine and bring into your central base in order to gain additional resources, in order to place additional mines, all the while building defensive turrets so that the waves of enemies that are coming in don't end up destroying your mining core. One thing I really like about Mindustry is how your resources have multiple uses. It's not just that you want to bring copper, for example, to your central production hub so that you can then spend it on as a building material to build things out of copper, but it has additional uses where you can, for example, route copper into a turret in order to improve the quality of the ammo of that turret. And a number of resources have a number of different uses, and in fact, a number of turrets benefit from various different resources. So copper might increase my ammo in one way, but iron would give me a different bonus. Now, I'm not really into tower defense at all, but that was actually fine in this one, since this was a game that I ended up playing with my brother quite a bit, and he's really into tower defense. And so we'd often split the labor, where early on we're both kind of building our infrastructure and getting our mines going, but later, as things get more complicated, I'll sort of do the resource management side of things, whereas he's more focused on our base defenses, which was a division of labor that worked out nicely. So even though Mindustry as a whole might not appeal to everybody, if you have a friend who's into either automating a big factory or into tower defense, and you yourself are into the other of those two things, this can be a fun way for the two of you to play a game together without necessarily having to engage in the part of the game that you're not as into. Kasho Minazuki is a young man with a dream, to leave home and open his own bakery. Unbeknownst to him, 2 of his family's 6 cat girls stowed away in his moving boxes, and he now has to deal with them at his new place of work. That is the premise of Nekopara, a visual novel series featuring, well, cute anime cat girls. Nekopara is a completely linear visual novel. There are no deviations or decisions to make at any point. It's just one straight shot from beginning to end. The main character, Kasho, is unvoiced, but all other characters in the game are fully voiced, although only in Japanese. But you do have a choice of English or Chinese translations for the subtitles if you so desire. There's not really any reason to replay the game, since the game will give you all unlocked CGs just available from the main menu. This is quite nice for me, since I can use that as an artistic reference. When trying to draw in an anime style, one thing that I've noticed with a lot of the games that I play is that the characters' hands are not drawn in a way that I particularly like. But Nekopara, the artist is really good at hands, which I hear is a hard thing, so it's a nice asset to have access to as far as an artistic reference. If you're playing the game on Steam, by default there will be no adult content in the game, and no nudity either. But there is a uncensored patch for the game as paid DLC. The adult content is I would say, of higher quality than what you'd see in a lot of visual novel games of this type. The scenes are fully voice acted and are even animated. Although it is a Japanese game, so even if you do pay for the DLC, you'll still have mosaic censorship. I first experienced Nekopara by watching an anime content creator do a playthrough of the game, and I found the playthrough to be rather funny and enjoyable, so I ended up buying the game to support the developers and the artist. That first experience, of course, was on YouTube, so there was no adult content in there whatsoever, and honestly, as an experience, I don't think that the adult content actually adds anything to Nekopara. Well, I mean, aside from the adult content, I suppose, but it doesn't affect the narrative in any particular way. If anything, I found that the scenes kind of drag on and sort of kill the pacing of the story. So absolutely, if you want a story of, cute girls doing cute things, this is something that you can enjoy absolutely without any of the adult content. You are not really missing anything unless that is specifically what you're looking for. Nekopara Volume 2 is a direct sequel to the first Nekopara game, and most of what I said about the first game applies here as well. Nekopara 2, however, is the better game in my opinion, since it has a number of small improvements. First, on the technical side of things, the characters in the visual novel segments, where you have a character on screen and text being voiced, the characters are more expressive and lively. I think that in the first game, the character images would move in response to various things that were happening in the dialogue, but they've really improved upon that and added more expressiveness to the characters in Nekopara 2. They've also added an option to pet the cat girls, so there's that. The other big improvement I would say that Nekopara 2 has over the first game is in terms of its story. The first game focuses mostly on chocolat and vanilla, or at least you would think so, but it suffers a lot from having a lot of time spent on world building and not as much time spent with the characters, and really I think the characters are the draw of the series. Nekopara Volume 2, despite ostensibly being about Azuki and Coconut, actually does more to develop chocolat and vanilla than the first game does in my opinion. A trope that I see in a lot of Japanese media when it comes to twin characters like chocolat and vanilla is that they're essentially just like one person in two bodies. Chocolat and vanilla were never the same person, but they really start to diverge and go their separate ways in terms of development in the second volume, and that's something that I appreciate. It also probably helps that Azuki is one of the characters that gets focused on here, since she is my favorite of the 6 cat girls in Nekopara. I think I relate to her just as an older sibling, and also as somebody who has worked in fast food and has been that competent person that ends up being tasked with keeping everything running while everybody else is, kind of stumbling through things. I find Azuki to be relatable, and that's probably, for me, the main reason why I would prefer Volume 2 over the other Nekopara games. Sakura Dungeon is a monster-capturing dungeon crawl adventure. Outside of the main town hub, you've got a large dungeon that's many levels deep, and that's pretty much all there is to the game. Now, I haven't played any other dungeon crawls really, but as a dungeon crawl adventure, I think this game did its job adequately. The combat has just enough depth to be interesting, and the collection of characters and monsters that you can gather over the course of the game give an interesting team-building aspect to it as well. It's nice that as you make progress in the dungeon, your party members will comment on various things that are going on, although this is also where a criticism of the game comes in, since the early game monsters tend to only comment on stuff that are within a couple of floors of where you'd find them. So if you take your, starting bunny monster all the way to the end of the dungeon, she's not going to have a whole lot to say after a couple of floors. Another issue that's related to this is that there are a number of more important NPC characters, in particular some of the human characters that will join your group over time, and they pretty much always have things to say once they're available, which means that if you're wanting maximum dialogue, you kind of only have 1 or 2 slots in your party that you can fit a monster to begin with. So you end up really just running the core NPC group for the most part, assuming that you want all the dialogue anyway. This is an adult game, but if you're playing it on Steam, it will be censored by default. There is a free uncensored patch available though, which you can find on the Steam forums. As far as the adult content in the game goes, well, so bad that it's good is maybe how I would describe it. The game tends to be pretty funny, and I like the contrived scenarios that a lot of the characters and monsters end up finding themselves in. It's just kind of funny to see, okay, the developers or the writers are going to do something with this, but what exactly are they going to end up doing? That can be amusing in its own right. One criticism I'd have of the game from an artistic standpoint is that the artist seems to have a type, let's just say that. While the various monsters and characters will have different outfits, ears, and tails, for the most part, they all have pretty much the same body shape, making a lot of the monsters end up feeling samey after a while. There is no voice acting in this game, and all of the events and CGs just use still images. If you're using the Uncensored patch, there are no mosaics. One thing I appreciate about Sakura Dungeon is that the damaged clothing mechanic isn't just for fan service. It actually exists as a mechanic in the game, decreasing the effectiveness of monsters both in your party and out in the world that you're fighting based on the state of their clothing. And on higher difficulties, you don't get free clothing repairs, so it can actually become something that you have to manage, which I think adds to the experience. Nanotale Typing Chronicles is a typing adventure game. Pressing the spacebar will shift your character from their mobile stance to their stationary stance, at which point a bunch of words will pop up on the screen that you can type to interact with various objects. These can range from gathering lore, solving puzzles, or even fighting enemies. The spells in this game use a keyword system where you can type out other words that you'll see at the bottom of the screen in order to modify your current spell in order to increase things like changing its area of effect or giving it an elemental affinity of some sort. I've always been intrigued by typing games. I think that Nanotale might be the best example in that genre or space that I've come across. As you explore the world in this game, it's mostly a combination of either combat sequences where you have to type a bunch of words quickly against mobs of enemies, or puzzle sequences where you have to figure out the right ways to manipulate your spells in order to affect the world around you. And while I do think that Nanotale is the most advanced typing game I've ever come across, I will say that the developer's previous work, Epistory, is probably still my favorite game within the genre space. Regardless, both Nanotale and Epistory are fantastic games, and I hope to see more games like this in the future. Celeste is a platforming game featuring a bunch of tough precision platforming challenges with the odd puzzle segment thrown in. Each level in Celeste will feature one or more unique stage gimmicks, which add a nice variety of challenges to the Celeste experience. Since a lot of these stage objects are not reused in later stages, it really gives each level a unique feel and allows each level to be its own contained experience. As long as you're avoiding the optional strawberries, I would say that the difficulty of getting through the main game, which is to say climbing Celeste Mountain, getting to the peak, is actually not that bad. It's a game that I think most people could handle, at least up to that point. However, when it comes to the later content, the game can be incredibly difficult. So for people seeking a more hardcore platforming experience, there's a lot of good content to do once you've beaten the main story. You can expect a lot of death and failure when playing through this game, but fortunately the respawn time is incredibly fast, so death isn't actually that punishing unless you're in the middle of a rather long sequence and you're towards the end of it. This quick respawn time is greatly appreciated. Battle Chef Brigade is a match 3 cooking game. The main portion of the game involves a number of cooking matches in a fantastic Iron Chef sort of parody style. The judges will tell you what their taste preferences are, the organizer of the tournament will then tell you what the theme ingredient is, and then you run out into the fields to fight monsters and gather berries and find whatever other items you can to add to your dish. You then run back to your kitchen, put your food into your pot, start stirring things around, and play a match 3 minigame in that portion in order to increase the quality of your dish. Now this might sound pretty simple on the surface, but Battle Chef Brigade is probably the most stressful game that I have played at all in the past year. The real problem here is time. You have so many different things that you want to get done, and your dish is never going to be as good as you want it to be by the time you're out of time for the tournament. Knowledge of the combat arena is also quite useful because different monsters will consistently have different flavor profiles, so if you're trying to appease a certain judge or find a particular ingredient, it's helpful to know where they are. Now, as for the kitchen itself, there's a number of different tableware that you can choose to bring in at the start of the match, but you don't have a whole lot of table space, so you have to make some hard choices. And they are hard choices, because all of the cookware is fantastic and useful, and you want all of it, but you can't have all of it. Now, despite this being a rather stressful, non-stop action kind of game, it's a good kind of stress. But it's not something I could see myself playing for long periods of time. It's fun to do a match or two, which don't take very long, and then go on and do other things. I don't think I could sit down and play this for hours on end. But Battle Chef Brigade definitely shows that Match 3 doesn't have to be a casual genre. The factory must grow to meet the needs of the growing factory. That basically summarizes the entire Factorio play loop. You start out on your map punching rocks until you can get a couple of miners going that you then have to manually fill with fuel. You quickly transition over to steam power, putting coal or wood into a bunch of boilers in order to generate steam and get power and electricity so that you can have your electric miners going, which are going to be more effective than the miners that you've been manually stocking with coal. And from there you just kind of go up and up as you automate everything. Somewhat ironically, one of the best achievements to do in Factorio as far as learning how to play the game properly is the Lazy Bastard achievement, which involves not manually crafting things yourself. Ultimately, you want to have the factory automate as much stuff for you as you possibly can, because even if individually your low-tier assembly machines are slightly less efficient than just manually handcrafting things, the fact that you can have more than one assembly machine more than makes up for it. Why craft 200 conveyor belts for yourself when you can just go to your chest that you've got 1,000 belts stocked in and just grab what you need while the factory replaces the contents of the chest for you? Ultimately, I find Factorio to be an incredibly satisfying game to play. It's just really nice to take a step back, look at what you've made, and say, I built that. There is a combat aspect to the game as well, as you build certain things, namely coal-powered steam engines and a bunch of miners and assemblers and all of that. You're going to generate a lot of pollution, and this pollution will anger the native life forms of the planet that you've crash landed on, the biters, and the biters will periodically raid your factory. Combat isn't the best experience in Factorio. You kind of get the job done, but ultimately I know a number of people that play this game prefer to play on peaceful mode or just disable the biters entirely, because really the focus is just on making a ridiculously big factory. However, if you do prefer the combat style of things, you can consider production challenges to be a part of the gameplay loop. Keeping your turrets supplied with ammo, after all, does require production. Finally, there's more advanced logistical options you can do. I personally like having far-flung mines scattered across the map and then a train network moving various resources from place to place. Despite the game's apparent complexity, I'm familiar enough with Factorio at this point to find it to be a pretty chill game where you just kind of get into it, identify a few problems or areas where your factory can use improvement, and there are always areas where your factory can use improvement, and just make progress. Age of Wonders 3 is a 4X strategy game in a fantasy world. The Age of Wonders franchise is known for its focus on combat, and success will require managing the combats a lot more than it will managing your colonies. City development is pretty simple overall, building structures and units, but the combat has a lot of depth, in particular with regards to positioning, flanking, and eating up enemy retaliations in order to protect the health of your own units. I've heard from a lot of people who've tried getting into Age of Wonders 3, and it seems like that they struggle quite a bit with the combat system initially. The AI has a tendency to suicide their units in order to get in a kill on one of yours, and a lot of people playing the game for the first time will find their heroes dying pretty quickly. The game features a campaign mode, but most people that I know play it primarily using the random maps. At the start of any map, you get to pick your leader. You can customize your leader's race from one of various fantasy factions, as well as picking your leader's class. Of the two, the class is far more impactful on how the gameplay will play out, with the race just providing a different flavor or variant on what that class will give you. On top of that, you get to pick some specializations, which include spheres of magic or various other types of leadership that can provide slight modifications to how things play out, but these are generally less impactful than the race and class choices. As far as 4X goes, this is a fairly fast-paced series. I would say on a standard-sized map, you're looking at 40 to 60 turns maybe for the match to be over. Although again, this comes from a more aggressive playstyle than I think a lot of people will have coming into this. In particular, people who've come over from something like Civilization complain that they're not able to deal with the AI's production. And the reason is that turtling up and developing a few settlements is going to be far less effective than expanding aggressively and taking as much territory as you can possibly hold. Of all of the games that I've ranked on this list, this is the game that probably suffers the most from burnout. I love this game, and I've put hundreds of hours into it. In fact, with the exception of Realm Grinder, this is the most played game I have on Steam, and something like Realm Grinder probably shouldn't be counted in those statistics. Part of the problem that I have with this game is that I started getting into the competitive multiplayer scene, and trying to play at a high level, including in some tournaments, sort of killed my enjoyment of the game. I'm a player who enjoys getting assigned a random leader and then trying to make the best of the situation that I end up finding myself in. Whereas if you want to take the game seriously at a competitive level, it's very important to very deliberately pick your class and race combination, and the specializations matter a lot at that level. This is a game that I'll still come back to from time to time, and I enjoy playing casually, but I don't think I'll be taking any more serious attempts at Age of Wonders 3 again anytime soon. Probably never. Tales of Maj'Eyal is a roguelike RPG set in a post-apocalyptic dark fantasy world. The gameplay may initially seem rather simple, but the mechanics behind it end up becoming quite complicated quite quickly. It's a turn-based game, and every turn you make a move or an attack, and then everything else will make a move. There's a wide variety of classes available, and each one plays quite differently from the others, which is nice, and adds a lot to the replayability of it. The classes don't only just have unique abilities, but also unique resources in some cases. My personal favorite resource in this game is Vim, which is a sort of life force energy that's used by dark corruption mages. And the thing that I like about Vim, as opposed to a more traditional mana system, is that it encourages people to use their abilities regularly and actively. With mana, I always find myself hesitant to use my powerful spells because I'm trying to save mana for when I'm going to need it, that big boss fight or whatever. And then you get to the boss and have way more mana than you need. That's just kind of how it goes. But with Vim, if you successfully kill something using a Vim spell, the spell cost is refunded to you. On top of that, your upper limit of Vim is actually quite low, but you gain Vim over time as you're killing things. Another example of an alternative resource system is the equilibrium used by natural classes or paradox used by the Chrono mages. For these classes, your spells are essentially free, but you get an equilibrium or paradox counter that increments every time you use an ability. And if you don't take the time to stop and reset your counters, then there start to become consequences. With equilibrium, it's just a simple spell failure. But with Paradox, you can start creating anomalies where the universe will forcefully reset some of your Paradox, but do something random that's probably bad. One criticism I would have of this game is that individual runs can be quite long if you get all the way to the end. I find that the length of the first continent is pretty decent, but once you finish that and then gain access to the second continent, well, at that point I've kind of lost interest in my character and I just want to start a new run. I would estimate that clearing the first continent takes about 4 hours or so, but it has been a while since I've done it, so I could be off with my estimate. One thing that I like about Tales of Maj'Eyal is that when you're coming into it as a new player, your class and race options are relatively limited. You're given a bunch of the simpler options, the ones that are more mechanically familiar, I guess, to people who play fantasy games. But the weird stuff tends to get unlocked as you do things out in the world. This is a roguelike game, so dying resets your progress, but there are certain things that you can do that will be persistent in terms of unlocks. Generally, this won't make you more powerful in your next run, but it will give you more options for what kind of characters you can bring into your next run. Some of my favorite experiences with Tales of Maj'Eyal were when I had a group of coworkers that we'd get together after work with some beer, and we'd make Tales of Maj'Eyal into a drinking game, where we'd be playing it individually, but if somebody died, then that person would drink and the other people would sort of lament their death kind of thing. It was a good time. One final thing I want to highlight about Tales of Maj'Eyal that I really like is the way it handles potions. The way it does this is by not having them. Instead, you have inscriptions that you can put onto your character, and each one has a healing effect, typically. So if we take your basic healing inscription, for example, your character can use this, but it's an ability that's on a cooldown. This is far superior to a potion system, in my opinion, because it allows you to spam your potions without worrying about a decreasing inventory. Now, overall, Tales of Maj'Eyal has a lot of really good ideas, and definitely it's worth checking out if you're into roguelike, stepping RPG games. Ori and the Blind Forest is a Metroidvania where you play as a spirit trying to restore the elements of water, wind, and warmth to a dying forest. This game does a fantastic job of setting the atmosphere with a fairly emotional story and great visuals. As far as Metroidvanias go, this one focuses heavily on the movement aspects of a Metroidvania and much less on combat. I would also say that the difficulty is relatively low, making this a somewhat approachable Metroidvania experience. This is a game that, even after finishing it, I still find myself coming back to from time to time because of the fantastic modding work of the community. In the past couple of years, I've really gotten into bingo randomizers, and the community for this game not only has a good randomizer, but also an integrated bingo, where it will mark the goals for you automatically without you having to tab out between applications. That being said, for replayability, I would consider the second Ori game to be an even better randomizer experience, but the first one is still interesting to come back to from time to time. The Civilization franchise probably doesn't need any introduction, since, for better or for worse, this is sort of the standard in the 4X space that other games inevitably get compared to. Sid Meier's Civilization V is my favorite of the mainline Civilization games. It shifts away heavily from the previous games in the series by adopting a 1 unit per tile limitation, so you no longer have massive stacks of units occupying a single space on the map. Things that I like about Civilization V are that the world feels more realized, I guess. The city-states are quite interesting, and I really like the diplomacy mechanics. I think they're the best diplomacy mechanics that the franchise has ever had, at least with regards to neutral factions and a diplomatic victory. Being able to build your own religion from a bunch of different pieces is also quite interesting and satisfying. And this implementation of religion was probably a smart move on the part of the developers to avoid any controversy by having set tenets for each faith. Although each of the civilizations only has a few minor adjustments from the others, with a unique ability and 2 unique buildings and or units, each civilization still has its own identity and feels quite different to play, which is nice. Finally, as you get into the industrial era and adopt an ideology, there's another interesting sort of global political situation that develops out of that. For me, Civilization V is a fairly relaxing experience. I like to build up my civilization from the Stone Age and then just exist in the world and see things progress over time. I'm not generally one to engage in conquest victories, although the combat in this game is actually pretty good for a Civilization game. I would say that the focus is much more on the city development side of things, however. I have played all 6 of the mainline Civilization games that have been released to date, and as I said earlier, the 5th is definitely my favorite of the series. Master of Orion is a Space 4X game. This particular version is a remake of the first 2 Master of Orion games, although I guess mostly just Mu 2, and it follows the same general formula. You start on one planet, and then you head out and colonize the stars. As you expand, you meet other alien races, and inevitably come into conflict with them. The colony management is fairly simple, but also satisfying, with the ability to micromanage slightly based on whether you want research, food, or production. One thing that I really like with the way the colony management is handled is that your citizens that are working in a particular resource will get less effective the more citizens that you invest in that resource. So your first farmer might produce 3 food, but then your second one will only produce 2. And building structures or terraforming the planet can improve these numbers and also improve the number of slots that are available to work in the first place. As for the combat, I'll be honest, I have never not used auto combat in this game. I know that there is a manual combat option. I think I maybe tried it once and just didn't feel like it was worth the time or effort. But playing this game with auto combat is a totally satisfying experience. There's not really any reason to do otherwise, in my opinion. I'm sure that there are people who love messing around with ship blueprints, though, so there is probably a whole other aspect to this game that I haven't even touched on that other people would get a lot of enjoyment out of. Now, as much as I want to recommend this game and continue singing its praises, there is a fairly big issue that's recently come to my attention. I have over 88 hours in this game on Steam, but there must have been an update sometime last year, and the game no longer works. The footage that you're seeing here is actually from my work laptop. I'm streaming it onto my main computer, and the laptop can barely even run the thing, but it can run the thing, whereas the main computer has a bunch of issues now, which it didn't have for those previous 88 hours, so I'm not sure what's going on with that. I spent a couple of hours troubleshooting it, and looking on the forums, the Steam discussion forums, it seems that the issues that I'm having now are issues that people have been having since 2016 that I guess have never been fixed. So it's a mystery to me as to why it's become a problem, but I guess if you're looking for a Master of Orion experience, I would probably just recommend getting the first 2 games off of GOG instead and playing them there. HuniePop is a match 3 dating sim. It's also a very silly game. So you start out as this loser who's having trouble with the ladies, and a love fairy takes pity on you and becomes your wingman. From this rather simple premise, you then go out into town interacting with various girls until you can get enough affection with them to bring them back to your place. The gameplay has 2 main components to it. There's the dating component, where you're playing a match 3 game in order to win a girl's affection, and there's a, I guess, visual novel-esque sort of thing. It's, basically you can talk to the girls and they'll tell you facts about themselves, and then they'll quiz you later to see if you remember what they've been telling you. The characters all have fairly nice personalities, and while the characters may fall into stereotypes, they are fairly entertaining in their own right and are generally pleasant to interact with. I think it really helps that the game doesn't take itself that seriously. The match 3 mechanics are surprisingly in-depth, and I actually quite enjoy the puzzle aspects of this game. You have an item loadout that you can bring with you for the match 3 segments, and each girl has her own preferences as far as which color matches will get you more points with her. The match 3 part of the game even carries over into the adult content, where apparently the girls get very excited about your rapid match 3 matching skills. As your love fairy Q says, "Come on, seduce me with your sexy puzzle skills." And I've learned a lot about relationships from this game, and I know it's going to help me going forward in my own life. Playing on Steam, the game will be censored by default, but there is a free uncensor patch available. The adult scenes themselves are just still images. There's not even any dialogue. Bloodstained, Ritual of the Night is a Metroidvania by one of the original creators of Castlevania. It features a large castle with a lot of different zones, different bosses, and different ways of getting around that allow you to get into areas that you couldn't previously. Typical Metroidvania stuff. I haven't actually played a Castlevania game, so I can't really comment on the similarities there, but the gameplay here stands up on its own anyway, even though I have heard that it's intended for fans of the original franchise. Of all the subsystems within this game, my favorite is probably the food system. I like the idea of having recipes be a permanent stat buff for your character. I think that rewards exploration and crafting and doesn't end up bogging things down too much at the same time. Really, it just makes every single recipe into its own little mini fetch quest. There are a ton of magical abilities that you can find and equip in this game, but I found myself sort of picking a few early on and just sticking with it. My biggest criticism of this game would probably be the imbalance of the boss fights. You'll have a couple of fights early on that are quite difficult, and then you'll have a bunch of fights that are almost trivial, and the difficulty balance just seems to swing back and forth pretty radically. Now, this is a game that I did a Let's Play of on my channel, and the Let's Play ended on somewhat of a sour note. Well, I have replayed the game recently, and I have some interesting thoughts on that. In fact, I think I might be making another video at some point in the future talking about the differences between playing a game for yourself versus playing a game for an audience, because I enjoyed this game way more the second time through. And I think a large part of that was that I had the freedom to just grind and level up and, I presumably had more skill and experience since it was a subsequent playthrough, but I really think it's just the grinding and completionist aspects of it were a lot more satisfying than feeling this pressure to constantly be pushing forward and finding new progress. Which is a lesson for me as somebody who plays games on the internet, I suppose. Thinking about it in hindsight, I probably should have done some off-camera grinding in between episodes in order to keep the pace of the series going nicely. So in that sense, this game has given me a lot to think about. I also remember complaining about the final boss in the past, but I had no problems with it whatsoever on my second playthrough, and I don't even think I used any healing items during that fight. So it was probably a combination of lower skill level and lower in-game level that were causing my issues the first time through. So I'm really glad that I did replay this because my impression of the game is much more positive and I give it a much higher recommendation than I would have after that first playthrough. Ori and the Will of the Wisps takes the formula of Ori and the Blind Forest and really refines it. This is yet another Metroidvania game, but when compared to its predecessor, this game is a lot more combat focused. However, it is still an Ori game, and so movement is still king. I guess it would be more accurate to say that the underdeveloped combat of the first game ended up getting fleshed out in the sequel. On top of that, the inclusion of a central town hub makes this world feel a lot more interesting than the previous one. The zones themselves are also a lot more interesting and varied, and the progression just overall feels more satisfying. This is a very good game. But even after having played through it the first time, I was happy to discover that the community had a randomizer mod for it. In fact, even if you're not intended in playing the randomizer, I would still recommend the randomizer mod because it allows you to tweak a few of the controls that makes the game feel a lot more intuitive for me. I know there are certain movement abilities I was consistently struggling with using in the vanilla experience, and the mod really ironed out those kinks for me. One big addition to this game that you didn't have in the first Ori was a variety of weapons. And while in my initial casual playthrough I did stick mostly to a couple of the weapons that you get early on, the additional weapons really help the game to feel fresh when you're doing randomizer runs because you're stuck using whatever the game decides to give you. Overall, I'd say the livelier world, the presence of a number of NPCs, and the improved combat make this a much better experience than Ori and the Blind Forest. However, like the first Ori game, this game still maintains a number of the escape sequences that the first game got known for. I definitely think I'll be coming back to this game in the future, probably doing more randomizer runs of it. Iconoclasts is a puzzle platformer, and while it is on the more linear side, I suppose it could also be considered a Metroidvania. In this game, you play a mechanic with a wrench and a stun gun. You run around fixing the world's problems. The first thing I've got to say about this game is, man, is this game gorgeous. I love the art here. On the gameplay side of things, the stun gun is quite satisfying to use, and the puzzle aspects are quite enjoyable as well. There are a number of chests scattered throughout the world, and solving puzzles will generally get you access to one of them, which gives you more materials that you can use to craft more tweaks, which are essentially slots that you can equip that give you various benefits. Character movement feels really nice too. One thing that makes Iconoclasts stand apart from any other Metroidvania platformer type game that I've played is how front and center the story of the game is. Platformers tend to be a lot more gameplay focused than story focused, and the games that do have stories tend to have the story be sort of in the background as window dressing to the overall experience. But in Iconoclasts, the story is really a driving factor of the game. Of course, your mileage may vary with that, but I personally quite liked the story. Iconoclasts also gets credit for being one of the few platforming games I've played where there was a darkness zone, and I didn't hate the dark gimmick. The boss fights in this game are quite interesting, because they're really a big spectacle. There's a bunch of over-the-top mechanisms and machines that are involved, and the first time you fight the bosses, your effort's going to be spent parsing what you have to care about and what you don't. But once you get that figured out, the fights themselves are totally fair and interesting. I recently played through the hard mode of the game, where you die in a single hit from anything, and I was able to get through most of the bosses without too much difficulty since I had some familiarity with their patterns. Overall, this is a cute game that feels great to play. Limbo is a puzzle platformer, in which you make use of various items in the environment in order to achieve certain tasks. Your controls are pretty simple. You can walk, you can climb up and down things, and you can grab things. There's no health or inventory, it's just a matter of getting from point A to point B. The most striking thing about this game is definitely going to be the aesthetic that the developers went for. And the world itself is a very hostile and dangerous place. There are also a number of little white egg cocoon things that you can pop that'll be worth achievements. They're essentially just rewards for exploring and finding unusual ways of dealing with the environment that aren't necessary for progression. This game does a fantastic job of getting you to interact in the environment in ways that make sense, without feeling unfair, despite the lack of direction that you're given at any given time. There are a few other interesting mechanics that are thrown in later, but I don't really want to get into spoilers, so suffice to say, this is an interesting game that does the environmental aspects well, and it's definitely worth checking out. Graveyard Keeper is an unusual game in the crafting/farming category. One day on the way home, you get hit by a truck, find yourself in another world, and now you're responsible for maintaining the church and its graveyard in a medieval society. The game is fairly open-ended with a ton of stuff to do, but no real direction as to what to focus on, which makes this game a decent, relaxing experience when you're just wanting to make progress on various tasks around the community. There are a number of NPCs that have their own desires, and the story of the game, such as it is, involves doing quests and other tasks for these NPCs in order to progress with their individual stories. On top of maintaining the graveyard, you can run a farm, you can fight monsters in a dungeon, and you can go fishing. There are a lot of tasks to do and a lot of things that you can customize around the area that you live in, which makes the game feel like you're always making progress towards something. It's also worth noting there's a bit of dark humor here, and if you choose to, you can do things like carving up bodies for meat, which you can then eat yourself or feed to others, and do various other things that you probably don't want polite society finding out that you're involved with. But at the same time, a lot of that stuff isn't necessary for progression, so you're free to play the game how you wish to. Grim Dawn is an action role-playing game. As is typical of the genre, you go around killing enemies and bosses, getting loot, and leveling up. One thing that's interesting about Grim Dawn is that you pick one class the first time you level up, and then at any point from level 10 onwards, you can pick a second class and end up being some sort of hybrid multi-class. The most interesting thing about Grim Dawn, though, in my opinion, is the lore of the universe that's been presented. The most interesting aspect of Grim Dawn to me is the lore. It's an interesting sort of technological level that they're set at, and the problems that they deal with are an interesting combination of magic and gunpowder. There are also a number of systems in the game that allow you to use one character to accelerate the growth of another character in a particular way. But at the end of the day, this really just feels like another action RPG to me. I've played several action RPGs in the past, and I usually enjoy them, and this just happens to be the action RPG that I'm playing currently. Warlock 2: The Exiled is a 4X fantasy game set in a very high magic setting. The world was destroyed and broken into shards, and each of these individual shards are connected to each other via portals. This is a slight variation from the more typical 4X experience, where instead of one large map where everything takes place, you instead have a number of smaller maps and the ability to teleport between them. Of all 4X games that I've ever played, I think Warlock 2 might have my favorite city building. Every population point in your city allows you to produce one structure, and that one structure is placed on the map somewhere around your city. Depending on the environment and resources around your city, you can get additional bonuses or penalties. On top of that, the structures act as roads, so there's an incentive to connect the structures of one city to the structures of another in order to keep your troops moving through places efficiently. The rare resources that you want to be building structures on give you an incentive to continue exploring because, of course, the planets or shards or whatever you want to call them that you start on are going to have the weakest resources, and the deeper you go into the portals, the more powerful and interesting the various resources will be that you come across. This is a game about making overpowered, ridiculous combinations of things work in your favor. As such, I would not recommend it for multiplayer, although I'm sure there are some people that do it. But for a single-player experience, it's kind of fun to bully the AI with some of the stuff that you can come up with. You can also run into some fairly ridiculous scenarios from time to time. I remember one undead versus undead match I was doing, where, well, the undead basically have access to 3 damage channels: melee, ranged, and death. Ghosts happen to be immune to all 3 of those damage channels. So having ghosts fighting each other in an undead-on-undead conflict can be pretty amusing. The magic in this game can really get out of hand, and is incredibly unfair and overpowered, which is part of the fun. It's also not a terribly serious world, but if you're wanting a different take on the 4X formula, this is a fun and silly way to pass a bit of time. Stardew Valley is a farming sim. Sick of your life working for the big corporation in the city, you decide to take up your late grandfather's offer and return to the farm that he owned near Pelican Town. From there, you have to fix up the land, fix up the house, and generally make an improvement in the community as the local farmer. You can grow crops, you can tend livestock, you can fish, you can mine. There's a lot of things that you can do in order to progress in the various systems that the game offers. There's also a community center that has a number of tasks in each of these areas that encourages you to explore everything that the game has to offer in order to finish up what's sort of your overarching goal, I suppose. There are also a ton of townspeople who each have their own schedules, and as you befriend them, they'll start giving you gifts, and eventually you can even date and marry one of them and have a family together. This is the game that I tend to do with my family whenever we're having a group gaming session. Since most of us like different games, this is one of the few ones that we all sort of seem to be okay with playing. And even when I'm not with my family, I've spent a lot of time with this game on my own as well. Sometimes it's nice just to have a more chill and relaxed game to play, and for me, Stardew Valley is one of those that I keep coming back to. Puyo Puyo Tetris 2 is a combination of 2 games. I imagine most people are familiar with Tetris at this point. It's that game where the blocks come down, and if you can make them into nice even rows, then the rows go away and you get points. Puyo Puyo is a similar game where you have these little jelly things dropping in pairs, and if you can get a bunch of them linked together of the same color, they'll disappear. Puyo Puyo Tetris 2 is a combination of both of these games. There are separate game modes if you wish to play one of them individually, but there's also a mixed mode where you switch back and forth between games every 30 seconds or so. I initially got this because I was interested in improving my Tetris ability. It's one of those games that I'm not particularly good at, but I wish I was. So every once in a while I feel this compulsion to try playing it. Puyo Puyo ended up being kind of fun too. The game also happens to feature a rather long single-player campaign if you want to go through a story mode, but I find the characters and story to be mostly forgettable. This is a game that I just keep returning to because I want to be persistent and I want to get better at it. Heroes Hour is a turn-based strategy game in the style of Heroes of Might and Magic. Specifically, I'd say it's closest to Heroes 2. You have your town where you build up your army, you have a hero that runs around with the army to do various things like clearing mines, gathering treasures, gaining experience, and from there you eventually get into a conflict with the other players as your armies fight with each other. Heroes Hour, however, is a very fast-paced game. In particular, the combat is done in real time, which actually ended up being a lot more fun than I initially thought it would be. Another strength of the game is that each town has a very distinct identity. There are a number of unique mechanics for every single faction, which makes trying out all the various options that are available quite a bit of fun. The random map generator also has a pretty good system for making your own maps if you so desire. Probably the biggest criticism that I have of this game is that the hero skills seem rather unbalanced. The game was a lot of fun when I was initially playing it, but after a certain point it started to feel like I was always going towards certain skill combinations because they were just way more effective than the other options that were available to me. Nevertheless, this is still a lot of fun, and I'm glad that this game didn't just end up being a complete copy of Heroes of Might and Magic and ended up doing some of its own thing. Starting off my top 10 list is Rabi-Ribi. This is a Metroidvania game with bosses that have bullet hell elements to them. The fight that you're going to be seeing on the screen right now is a relatively early game boss, but rest assured that the bosses and bullet patterns get pretty crazy towards the end of the game. This is the first bullet hell or bullet hell adjacent game that I've ever played, which is probably why I suck at it so much. But it's been a great experience all the way through, and I've quite enjoyed learning how to deal with boss patterns. It's one of those things where you can watch somebody play a bullet hell game, but until you've actually tried to play it yourself, you don't really appreciate some of the things that the players are doing. Certain patterns, for example, are seemingly impossible to dodge, and then you realize that you have to actually lead the shots in a way in order to create a pattern that you can get around. One interesting thing about Rabi-Ribi is that you have a choice of what kind of progression you want to be playing when you start a new game file. You can either have it so that every time you gain an item or upgrade, all of the bosses in the game get more powerful, or you can have it so that bosses increase in power as you hit certain story beats and make plot progression. This way, depending on how you want to play, you can either be rewarded for finding all the items and getting stronger, or you can take on these boss fights quickly without having to worry about leveling up and finding things. In either case, you do get stronger by finding more items, so it's still probably worth doing. One thing that may be slightly off-putting to people is the art style, and in particular the fan service that this game has to offer. There's nothing in here that's too egregious, though, I would say, and certainly it's not something you'd have to worry about censorship or adult content or anything like that if you were to play through the game. This is a game where the achievements are actually achievements, so if you want a game where you have to work for your accolades, this is the game for you. HyperDimension Neptunia Rebirth 1 was my introduction to the Neptunia franchise. I know that it is a remake of an older game, but experience with the older game is not required to get the experience out of this. In fact, from what I understand, the story was changed quite a bit, so the previous game doesn't really matter except as a historical artifact or curiosity at this point. This is a JRPG game where you play as Neptune, who is a goddess with amnesia, trying to find her former memories and put an end to the console war. The Neptunia franchise is rather irreverent with regards to the gaming medium. The entire game is full of references and jokes, and the main characters themselves are no exception. Neptune, the heroine that you play as in this game, is a representation of the Sega Neptune, which is a discontinued Sega console. Discontinued? I don't think it was ever released. The other three goddesses in the series represent the Sony PlayStation, the Nintendo Wii, and the Microsoft Xbox. The premise of the world itself is that you're engaging in something called the console war, where each of the goddesses is trying to accumulate shares by taking them away from other people in order to become the one true goddess. Silliness aside, I actually quite like the mechanics that are at work in this game. The combat is an interesting take on the turn-based JRPG formula, and one that I quite enjoy. JRPGs have an issue where you tend to accumulate a lot of skills as the game progresses, and then in combat you're just spending so much time scrolling through menus in order to get to the abilities that you want to use. This game gets around that by having you pre-select a loadout of moves, and as you level up you get more points and can put higher cost moves into your loadout. You're also somewhat limited in terms of the types of moves that you want to bring with you. So having one character focus on power moves that deal more damage, and another that focuses on guard breaks in order to weaken the enemies so that those power moves can do even more damage, is not a bad strategy. I also really appreciate that Compa's starting healing move does percent health heal instead of a flat amount, meaning that her one healing move will be viable all the way to the end of the game, and you don't need to have a list of, Cure, Curaga, and all that. The story itself is alright, but I don't think that you play this game really for the story. The characters themselves are definitely the selling point, with the personalities being reasonably well fleshed out and the interactions between the characters being entertaining to witness. The remake system in the game is also an interesting idea, where you can spend... The game also has some pretty long attack animations, although the developers did courteously allow you to skip them with the button press. So while you might want to enjoy the spectacle the first 2 times you use a character's ultimate move, later on, if you're just wanting to get through the combat and get onto the next part of the game, the next dungeon, the next story beat, you can start skipping through things if you wish to do so. It's greatly appreciated. Another criticism that I have of this game is that I think there are too many characters that you get access to in your roster. You've got the 4 goddesses, you've got Compa and IF, who are sort of 2 other main characters that follow you around. And then you've got a ton of other characters that also end up accumulating over the course of the game. However, your party is limited to 3 members, meaning that the vast majority of your roster is just not being used at any given time. I guess it's nice that you can choose who you want to have in your party, but overall I found it kind of annoying to have so many characters to deal with. I think you have like 18 by the end of the game, something like that. And so I ended up just picking a core group of characters that I liked and sticking with them throughout most of the game. There's also a ton of customization that you can do. Most of that's going to involve fighting monsters to get parts and then unlocking various outfit options for the characters. Overall, not the most serious of JRPG games, but one that does a lot of things that I really like, and one that I find a lot of enjoyment in playing. HyperDimension Neptunia Rebirth 2 Sister's Generation is the sequel to HyperDimension Neptunia Rebirth 1. Rather than following Neptune and the other goddesses, this game focuses on their younger sisters, who are representative of handheld consoles, with the main character this time around being Nepgear instead of Neptune. And I have to say, Nepgear is the better Nep. I like this game a lot more than the previous one, just because Nepgear actually has a proper hero's journey story arc, and isn't just breaking the fourth wall endlessly. As a main character, she makes a much stronger impression than Neptune, in my opinion. This game also allows you to have 4 party members active in battle at a time instead of just 3, which helps somewhat with the even larger, more ridiculously bloated roster that this game has, but the large roster is still kind of an issue. The storyline of this game is completely disconnected from the first game, so any of the events that happened there don't matter, so you can just start with this one if you wish to do so. I believe it's taking place in another dimension or something like that. So the characters' personalities stay the same, but their memories and histories no longer... there's no continuity there. In terms of story, I think this game is also a little bit better than the first game. One of the things that they went maybe a little bit overboard with in this one is the number of endings that you have available. Something I didn't mention with the first game, but I use both of these games for artistic reference, so I appreciate having the album and museum features so that you can check things out. You can check out any CGs that you've unlocked after the fact. I think the art style in general for these games is relatively simple but effective, making it something that's worth trying to emulate as I'm trying to improve my own artistic abilities. I don't want to spend too much more time on the Neptunia series, so I'm just going to end this off with one little criticism of this one that I didn't particularly care for, which was the Stella minigame. Fortunately, this minigame is completely ignorable if you don't care about all the achievements, but the Stella dungeon crawl minigame itself is gated by real-time progression, and by the time I had done literally everything else that the game had to offer, I still wasn't done with this silly minigame. I have yet to play the third Neptunia Rebirth game. From what I understand, we'll be going back to playing with Neptune as the protagonist, which I'm a little bit sad about, but hopefully it'll still be a fun experience. Hollow Knight was one of the first Metroidvania games that I've ever played, and it was a fantastic experience. There's this big, huge world you can get lost in. You can explore it in a number of different ways. At this point, I've seen a number of different people play through this game, and everybody seems to find their own path through the game, and yet everything still feels intended. As far as the interconnecting levels go, it's really incredibly well done. There's also a lot of focus on the combat in the game, with the boss fights being such a big part of the game that they even dedicated the final DLC to the idea. Hollow Knight is one of those games that every time I put it down and then come back to it later, it seems like I've just somehow gotten better at the game. And it's really satisfying to see that my skills are progressing as I continue to play it. If I remember right, my Let's Play on the channel ended with me rage quitting against White Defender, and I find that to be a pretty comfortable fight at this point, so that's nice. Likewise, in a randomizer I did recently, I ended up taking on Nightmare King Grim, because I forgot that he doesn't offer you anything and there's no reason to fight him, when I had very minimal gear, and it was totally doable. Speaking of randomizers, the randomizer for this game is the reason why it is so high on this list, because I still play this game. I've beaten it many times, and I still come back and play it again. I've also dabbled a little bit with speedrunning, although nothing too terribly impressive on that front, but really it's the randomizer that keeps bringing me back to Hollow Knight. I think I've always been the kind of player who prefers having to improvise based on what I'm given, rather than mastering some sort of mechanical execution to a problem that I already know. I don't really want to say too much about the game, because this is really something that I think you should go in with as few spoilers as possible and just kind of explore for yourself. So all I'll say is that this is a fantastic game, and if you like Metroidvanias or platformers, then you should definitely be giving this game a playthrough. Of course, if that does describe you, then you've probably already played it. I think that Persona 4 Golden has the best story that I've ever seen in a video game. This is a JRPG. You play as a Japanese high school student whose parents are working overseas, so you get shunted off to live with your uncle for a year in some rural town. Coincidentally, shortly after you arrive in town, a murder happens. The narrative of the game is a murder mystery. You and your friends from school are running around town trying to figure out what's going on, who's behind the killings, and ultimately to save people who've been abducted and prevent the murderer from getting away with additional murder. The gameplay itself is split between two very distinct modes. You have a visual novel style slice of life school and dating sim sort of thing, where you can run around hanging out with your friends, doing part-time jobs, increasing stats, studying for exams, all of that sort of stuff. On the other hand, you have the TV world, where you get to go do the JRPG dungeon crawler side of things. What makes Persona 4 such a special game is the way that everything sort of connects together. The game is really about characters, character growth, character development, characters overcoming their own fears and insecurities, and the dungeons of the game reflect the issues that the characters are having. On top of that, becoming closer friends with the people around you will give you bonuses that carry over into the dungeon segments. Given that the story and the characters are so important to the experience of Persona 4, there's not really a whole lot I can talk about without giving anything away. So I'm just not going to talk about any of that stuff. All I'll say is that it's very good and it's worth experiencing. In terms of gameplay, while the dungeon segments will feel the most game-like, I actually found myself enjoying the visual novel segments a lot more. By the end of the game, you really get to feel like you know this band of people who've been coming together to try to solve the issues in this town. I haven't played any of the other Persona games, but if Persona 4 is any indication, this is a franchise that I'm going to be spending a lot of time with in the future. DROD RPG is neither DROD nor RPG, although it has some mechanics and elements from both. This is a resource management puzzle game. You wander through dungeons, picking up health potions to gain yourself more health, finding various items to increase your stats, and fighting monsters. Combat resolves automatically with you versus the monster, and the amount of damage that you take from initiating a combat is calculated just based off of your attack and defense stats, and resolved immediately. The resource management aspect of the game is in trying to figure out what you're capable of doing with your current amount of health and how you can chain a bunch of these decisions together in order to end up with as much health as possible by the end of it. There are also various other items that'll let you do some cool things, such as breaking down walls or triggering doors and the like. Speaking of doors, one of the biggest decisions you're going to have to make in this game probably is where you spend your keys. The thing that keeps DROD RPG alive and keeps me coming back is the level editor. This is a game that benefits tremendously from having a community that still plays and creates content for the game. In fact, what you're seeing on the screen right now is a level of mine that's in development and should be coming out reasonably soon if I can just finish polishing up a few little issues that I have with it. If you're more competitively minded, there is a scoreboard for this game as well. Various actions in the game will count as score checkpoints, usually defeating a boss, and once you've completed a score checkpoint, you can be measured against every other person who is connected to the server who has also beaten that boss, and you'll be given a percentage for how efficient you were, basically, in terms of score, which is mostly going to be determined by your stats and your health. And if you're really trying to optimize points, having unused keys is another big factor. At a glance, DROD RPG might not seem like much of a puzzle game, but there's quite a bit of complexity going on in here, and the optimization process is itself the interesting puzzle. For easier level sets, you might be able to get to the end even if you're not playing terribly optimal, but for the harder stuff you might find yourself having to reset if you've been too careless with the amount of health you're spending on various things. Planetfall is the sci-fi spin-off to the Age of Wonders franchise. Age of Wonders is a 4X turn-based strategy series. In Planetfall, you find yourself colonizing a new planet. When choosing or creating your commander, you choose a starting race and a secret technology, which essentially is your faction's goal for planetary domination. For example, if you choose the Promethean secret tech, your goal is to release a bunch of combustible gas into the atmosphere and basically light the entire atmosphere of the planet on fire while hiding inside your own fireproof bunkers. Whereas something like Synthesis would involve hacking the machines of the world and basically controlling everything in that way. Unlike the other Age of Wonders games, which are in a fantasy setting, this one focuses more on ranged combat since a lot of units have guns. Planetfall also has the most advanced city management in the series so far. The Age of Wonders franchise is known for its combat, and the combat in Planetfall is just as fun as it is in the previous installments of the game. You take your small squad of units and attack the enemy using a variety of interesting abilities and effects. The unit variety is immense, which makes it hard to understand everything at a glance at times, and definitely rewards people who are experienced with the game and its interactions and units. I also think that neutral factions are done better here than they have been at any other time in the Age of Wonders franchise's history. The influence resource is an interesting idea, and the NPC quests are much more interesting than they were in Age of Wonders 3. I know that the sci-fi setting might be off-putting for people who are more used to the fantasy setting of the rest of the franchise, but Planetfall is, in my experience, is the most fun version of Age of Wonders to exist to date. And I'm really excited to hear that a lot of the lessons they've learned from Age of Wonders Planetfall are going to be taken going forward into the recently announced Age of Wonders 4. Monster Hunter Rise is, unsurprisingly, a game about hunting monsters. The basic gameplay loop is that you go out into the field, hunt down a large monster, which is basically a boss fight that could take you anywhere from 10 to 40 minutes to defeat. And then you go back to town and use parts from that monster to craft yourself some better weapons and armor, which you then use to go out and hunt bigger monsters. An interesting thing about the progression in this game is that you do not have experience. You do not level up, you do not get stronger over time. Everything is entirely based on your gear. Another interesting thing about the gear is that there are 14 unique weapon types in the game, and each one has a completely different moveset and feels completely different to play. This means that even if you mess around with a couple of weapons and don't like them, there's still a good chance that there's going to be a weapon available that you'll end up enjoying using. My first Monster Hunter game was Monster Hunter World, and when I made the transition from World to Rise, I wanted to use completely different weapons so that I'd be playing something I didn't have any experience with in the previous game. So in Rise, my main weapon ended up being the Insect Glaive, and when I want some variety, I pull out the Heavy Bowgun. The fact that I'm using completely different weapons in the two games makes it difficult to compare the two directly, since the weapons that I'm using in Rise feel completely different from anything that I ever used in World. On top of that, the wirebug mechanics make you feel a lot more mobile in this game than you have been in any previous Monster Hunter game. I honestly have mixed feelings about the wirebugs. On the one hand, they feel great to use, but on the other hand, the monsters just aren't as scary as I remember them being, since at this point, you're basically a superpowered anime character that can pull off all these crazy moves, and the monsters just don't seem to be able to keep up with you. I like the concept of hunting helpers, which are these little monsters in the world that you can pick up and then use for various effects throughout the combat. For example, a paratoad can be unleashed to create a cloud of paralytic gas, I guess, that will temporarily stun any monsters or players that are caught within the area. I'm less keen on the Spearbird idea, since the start of a hunt seems to involve running around the map, tagging a bunch of these silly little things in order to get your stats up before engaging with a large monster. It honestly just feels like busy work. I never thought that I would enjoy a Monster Hunter game, and it's very different from anything else that you've seen on this list, but the overall gameplay experience happens to be one that I find myself coming back to again and again. It also helps that the Monster Hunter games ended up being my go-to multiplayer games with my gamer friends, so it ends up just being a good experience, regardless of what we're hunting. Monster Hunter World, like Monster Hunter Rise, is a game about hunting monsters. Since I've just talked about Monster Hunter Rise and the Monster Hunter games in general, in this part I think I'm going to mostly be explaining the differences between the two games, World and Rise, as I see them. I should also state up front that deciding which order to rank these two games was rather difficult. One reason for that is that I used completely different weapons in each game. In Monster Hunter World, I main Lance and also play Hunting Horn, and in Rise I was maining Insect Glaive with a bit of heavy bowgun on the side. I would say that overall, World feels like a much slower and more deliberate game. When you attack in World, you're committing to the attacks. When the monsters attack in World, you better know how they're attacking and be able to get out of the way or block, or else you're going to go flying. In Rise, the wire bug mechanic allows you to wire fall out of danger, and in general you just seem to be better able to deal with the monsters. Now, to be fair, part of this could be my choice of weapons. Despite Lance and Insect Glaive both ostensibly being polearm weapons, they could not be more dissimilar, at least without branching into the ranged weapon category. The Lance is incredibly slow, and when the monster's attacking, a lot of the time you just have to raise your shield and take the hit. Whereas with Insect Glaive, you can spend a lot of the time in the air and just generally not be where the monster's attacking. World is a much bigger game than Rise, by which I mean the environments that the monsters move around in are much more fleshed out, they're much more interesting, and the behavior of the various creatures in the area actually plays out somewhat like an ecosystem, whereas in Rise, things are just kinda there for you to interact with. To be fair, Rise was originally a handheld game, so it's to be expected that it would be somewhat more limited in that regard. I think overall, the phrase attention to detail really applies to Monster Hunter World. The Rathian, which you see me fighting right now, is a creature that has a venomous tail, and if you do enough damage to the tail with a slashing weapon, you can sever it. Once you've done this, the Rathian can no longer poison you. In Monster Hunter Rise, for whatever reason, if you sever the Rathian's tail, it doesn't actually seem to do anything. My friends and I have been poisoned by a Rathian after severing its tail, which just seems somewhat disappointing. You go through all that effort, and you're not really rewarded with a whole lot. This is also going to be a silly thing, but in Monster Hunter World, I find the fishing to be a lot more satisfying than in Rise. World gives you more of a sense of exploration, and there's also more of a story, which makes the single-player experience better than that of Rise, in my opinion. However, when it comes to multiplayer, I will admit, Monster Hunter World is a pretty janky game. Getting multiplayer to work is a pain, especially if you have one player who is experienced or playing with a character who's gone through the story, and the other one being relatively new to the game. This is because a lot of the monsters in this game have a cutscene that you have to see before you're able to hunt them, and the developers didn't want to bother rendering a second hunter in the cutscene, so you end up having to accept a quest as a new player on your own, and nobody else is allowed to join your hunt until you've seen the monster and triggered the cutscene. This makes multiplayer team-ups a little bit awkward if you're trying to play with a new player. So if I were to summarize the experience for World versus Rise, I would say that World was more fun as a single-player experience, but Rise was a lot more convenient to play through if you're trying to play with a friend, especially if you and your friend are at different levels of experience with the game. If you've been following my channel for any length of time, it's probably no surprise that Deadly Rooms of Death will get the top spot on my list for 2022. DROD is a puzzle game where you are a dungeon exterminator who is tasked with going into basements and other dangerous places and killing all of the monsters in said places with a really big sword. Gameplay is turn-based, so every time you make a move or rotate your sword 45 degrees, every monster in the room will then make a move in response. There are also a number of non-monster mechanisms, such as bombs and pressure plates, that can add a lot of complexity to the room in question. The basic combat in this game may initially look simple, but this is a puzzle game, and the community is quite active with the level editor. So it's no exaggeration that this is probably the hardest puzzle game that I have ever played, at least given the stuff that the community's been coming up with lately. The level editor definitely contributes to the longevity of the game, since there's always new content and there's a small but dedicated community around this game. There's also a competitive aspect to this game for those who are interested, in that every single room will be tracked on the CaravelNet servers, and your score at completing a room is the number of moves that it took you to beat it. A lower score is better. There are people that compete with room optimizations, so that is another way to extend the longevity of the game in those lulls between new hold releases. While a lot of the content being produced in DROD is quite difficult, the fourth game in the series, Gunthro and the Epic Blunder, makes for a decent starting point for people who are wanting to experience this game at a more reasonable level of difficulty.